I am Dr. C.H. Lakshmi Kumari, working as Assistant Professor at Institute of Public Enterprise. Today I am here to deal with the public enterprises and international scenario. The present module deals with the background of public enterprises, their role, scope, and objectives of public enterprises. The module also covers various issues and the background of public enterprises at international level also. First, we will see how these public enterprises and their functioning, objectives, and role in Indian context. Since 1930, and particularly after World War II, numerous state-owned enterprises, also called as public enterprises, were created in both developed and developing countries. To address the market deficits and capital shortfalls, promote socio-economic development, reduce mass unemployment, ensure national control over the overall direction of the economy, especially in developing countries. By providing capital and technology to strategic areas where the private sector either shied away from or lacked the capacity to invest, most governments resorted to public enterprises to increase capital formation, produce essential goods at lower costs, create employment, and generally contribute to the economic development of the nation states. This trend continued till the early 80s. The major objective scope of the public enterprises are participation of government in business and industry through state enterprise systems world over are almost the same for every enterprise at global level. To accelerate the growth of core sectors of the economy is the main objective of all the public enterprises over all the state governments around the world. Next, to enable the government in discharging its social obligations in respect of operation of the public utilities and public distribution mechanism of essential goods of mass consumption, mainly to ensure their ready availability at fair and affordable prices. To enable the government to exert countervailing power on the operations of private monopolies and multinationals in selected and critical areas. To provide a springboard for the economy to achieve a significant degree of self-sufficiency in the critical sectors. Public enterprises continues to have a major presence in many national economies. In high-income countries, public enterprise share of gross domestic product is 8% and its investment constitutes 13%. In middle income countries, this share of gross domestic product was 9% and investment was 17%. In less developed countries, this gross domestic product share was 14% and investment was 28%. These public enterprises constitute an important source of government revenue in many of the developing countries. Especially in China, Thailand and Turkey, it was 6%. In certain regions of North African countries like Algeria, the contribution of these public enterprises to government revenue was 60%. In Egypt, it was 12%. In Morocco, it was 14%. And in Tunisia, it was 7%. These state-owned enterprises are large in number in countries like China, United Arab Emirates, Russia, Indonesia, and Malaysia. The number of state-owned enterprises were more in sectors like natural resources, energy and heavy industries, telecommunications, financial, warehousing, architectural engineering activities. Now, we will look into the major areas of operations and the priorities of the state enterprises in various countries across the globe. In India, during the last 50 years, the public enterprises run both at central level public enterprises and also at the state level as state-owned enterprises. They have been making significant contribution in almost all sectors of the economy. In the process of accelerating the nation-building activities, the responsibility for the developing and growth of core industries is taken care by the central government. However, the operation of public utilities in general left to the respective state government. On the other hand, the operation of public utilities and some other organizations which are evidently characterized as intermediary government agencies or as the extended arm of the government in discharge of the state social obligations are generally left to the respective state government. The style of functioning of these state-owned enterprises clearly represents a different picture as compared to their counterparts in central public sector enterprises at the central level, in that they directly impact the functioning of the state political system. In numbers of state-owned enterprises are almost 5 times more than central public sector enterprises. But in terms of investment, turnover, and all other financial parameters, central public sector enterprises are far as higher compared to state-owned enterprises. The volume of operations and other financial parameters of the manufacturing sectors, which cover a wide spectrum of the commercial activities, continue to be the more prominent compared to the other sector and in specific by central public sector enterprises compared to state-owned enterprises. The state-owned enterprises located in certain states in India are having a good share in their industrial activities besides their dominant role in public utilities. It is gratifying to note that the domestic capabilities attained by the public sector enterprises in India are not only restricted to the manufacturing and supply of capital equipment but also extended in undertaking many mega projects in select sectors on a concept to commissioning basis. Indian central public sector enterprises in particular are able to offer solutions through systems and services in the field of energy, industry, transportation, infrastructure, communication, and other key areas. In recent years, the service sector gained a most unforeseen and unprecedented spurt, which is almost to identical or even more than the manufacturing sector. It is happy to note that the Indian public enterprise system had quietly adapted to these changes and is able to effectively compete with the private sector enterprises or MNCs at global level. Some of the state enterprises are now playing a dominant role in the service sector too, with their widespread operation in areas such as contract and construction services, financial services, industrial development and technological services, tourist services, transportation services, and trading and marketing services. The trading and marketing enterprises in various states are receiving due support and encouragement for thrust on exports and for creating suitable infrastructure at the state level. The enterprises created under Section 25 of the Company Act of 1956 are more oriented to promote welfare activities, especially in promoting economic support to the backward classes of the society comprising of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, minorities, children, women, and other handicapped people. Apart from 12 central public sector enterprises, some of the state governments in India have set up a good number of welfare enterprises to extend a helping hand to the backward classes of the society. Coming to Canada, the government business enterprises operate at 3 levels: at the federal level, at the provincial level, and at territorial level, and also at local government level. The business conducted at these 3 levels are distinctly different. At the federal level, the nature of activities carried out covers railway operations, broadcasting, mortgage and building construction, air transport security, postal operations, currency trading, nuclear power generation, minting and banking operations. The business enterprises operating at the federal level are referred to as Crown Corporation. At the provincial and territorial level, the business handled or reported as lottery business, sale of alcohol, etc. At the local government level, the activities carried out are limited to bus transportation, management of utilities like electricity, gas, and transportation. Government-run business houses and other activities handled by the government like education in schools, colleges, vocational training have the umbrella coverage of public sector. Coming to Singapore. In Singapore, the span of coverage with respect to industrial activity under government control appears to be very pronounced. The government control is reported to be operative under two conditions: government-linked companies and government statutory boards. The government-linked companies are controlled through a wholly owned government holding company which holds shares in the business entities like Mapletree Investments, Singapore Power, Neptune Orient Lines, Semiconductor Manufacturing, Sing Telecommunications, Singapore Technologies Engineering, Media Corporation, and Singapore Airlines. Compared to Canada, in Singapore, the span of coverage of government-controlled companies is much wider. The activities covered including engineering, air transport, broadcasting and mass communication, public transport, telecommunications and power generation, transmission and distribution, electricity and gas retailing, real estate, shipbuilding, shipping and port management, etc. The situation in Singapore appears close to India in terms of government participating in industrial and business activity. The government of Singapore is intensely focusing on efficiency and thoroughness in all its endeavors. The government machinery can be its civil services, statutory bodies, or government-controlled business houses is laying greater emphasis on talent. The remuneration is not taken as a constraint for inducting or retaining talent, including in civil services. Similar to Singapore, in Australia also, they had a holding company concept for promoting and monitoring its government business enterprises. Apart from closely monitoring the fiscal and financial performance of its global government business enterprises, the holding company, working under the guidance of Government Business Advice Branch, explicitly brings out the statement of corporate intent of its enterprises in consultation with its shareholder ministries. The government business enterprises includes Australian Government Solicitor, Australian Postal Defence Housing Corporation, Australian Health Service Limited. Comparatively, the degree of coverage in the government-controlled business in Australia appears to be much less in scope. The accent is on public utilities and welfare activities like rail, transport, postal service, health service, banking and housing. Coming to France, in France, the public sector was massive in all areas of economy, including banking and automotive industry. This was the result of nationalization of several enterprises in different areas till 1981 in France. However, privatization is carried out since 1986 and a number of these enterprises like French Telecom, Air France, toll motorway companies have been privatized. Privatization of a number of sector enterprises like Airbus, Arena Space have been carried out wherein the state equity stake dropped below 50%. The number of public enterprises have come down from 3,500 to 1,400. All these enterprises got privatized in course of time. In spite of this, the public enterprises in France remain substantial in sectors like transport, health, energy, etc. The major public sector enterprises in France include Electricité de France, Gaz de France, Aerospatiale, French Telecom, Renault and Airport de France. Public sector enterprises had played a key role in the economic development of France with a major infrastructure programs in the areas of energy, transport and telecommunication. Most of these programs include French Telecommunication Program launched in 1974, French Nuclear Program launched in 1974, and Government Holding Agency oversees the affairs of all these state-owned enterprises in France. The major strength on which the French public sector enterprises depends are the major leveraging factors here can be attributed to ability to cope with long-term objectives, ability to carry high debt with the state guarantees, and ability to define a strategy including public service priorities. Factors which are generally quoted as the weakness of Indian public sector enterprises structure are referred to in the same context in France also. Typical of these are political influence in the management of public sector enterprises, overstaffing with conservative trade unions, difficulty to cope with a competitive environment, and slow to react when facing problems. Public enterprises in France played a very key role in major infrastructure programs that include areas like energy, transportation, and communication. The French telecom is cited as a successful public enterprise in terms of improving the infrastructure in the period between 1975 to 1985, when the need was felt and when things have substantially improved. The sector was opened for competition with increased privatization. In the early 70s, the telephone density in France was the lowest in Europe and the quality of service was very poor. An ambitious investment plan was launched and carried on by French Telecom, which was a 100% public company. The enterprise French Telecom was in pioneer of new technology, that is digital switching and data networking. Within a decade, the quality of the telephone service became one of the best in Europe. French Telecom was very profitable, which created a lot of envy as it was operating as a monopoly enterprise in France. In the period 1985 to 2005, the telecom market was progressively open to competition in the areas of mobile service, business service, international and residential connections. Challenged on the home markets, the telephone companies started to look for new markets abroad also. The human resources were diversified and the top management were changed with induction of CEO from management from the private sector. A new competitive spirit was nurtured without forgetting the value of public services. For years, the privatization of French telecom has been a very controversial issue. It happened late when the controversy has dissipated. In 1997, a minority stake of French Telecom was listed on the stock market in France and New York, that is in Paris. The employees were offered shares at attractive prices. The IPOs was very successful. The state ownership was progressively reduced from 80% to 51%. The ownership was dropped below 50%. The major holdings in state public enterprises are now held by an autonomous agency created in 2003 called the French Government Shareholding Agency. The French policy aimed at diversifying the shareholding structure that will team up public and private investors as well as the employees. The state equity stake dropped from 50% in the major public or private enterprises in the high technology strategic domains of aerospace, defense, and aviation sectors. Public enterprises are floated in the stock market while retaining state control for providing funds to the budget, changing the management, culture of the company, complying with standard accounting rules, and promoting employees' equity stake. The basic rule adopted in France for the management of public enterprises are, in spite of privatization program, public enterprises remain numerous in several sectors, that is transport, health and energy. The market is always the best judge of the performance of the public enterprises. Control must be done by a professional and independent body. Competition is often the best way to put pressure on the performance and on the management and change corporate culture. Developing employee ownership is a good incentive. Private investors are most often necessary as an additional source of funds. Public authorities function as good strategic stakeholders and put in position organization, and procedures adapted to this goal, including the choice of CEOs. Keeping in view the growing importance of public enterprises, the government of almost all countries started looking at the reforms in public enterprises. In almost all countries, the governments have started bringing out various reform programs in order to improve the performance of these public enterprises and to keep them on par with the other competing public enterprises in the market at global level. The integration of the national economy in the global market had led to the concept of privatization of public operations, leading to a reduction in direct state participation in traditional commercial and public service activities. Nevertheless, despite more than 15 years of privatization, government ownership is still prevalent in a number of regions and countries, particularly in certain basic sectors where the government intervention is very much required and where the public enterprises works for the welfare of the people. The government has not lost its interest and hope and on the control on these enterprises. The operating environment and the size of the market all have important bearings on the size of the private sector. In countries where the contribution of public enterprises is relatively lower than the private sector, the strategic importance of PEs to the national economy is still quite significant. In some cases, privatizing the firm may be a rapid way to improve its capacity to compete because it addresses many of the unsolved problems and can compete with the environment in the market. In other cases, a government can enhance a state-owned firm's ability to respond to competition by improving its institutional environment and its management. In any case, reform programs should attempt to orchestrate both the stimulus of heightened competition and response. Improvements in the state firms or their divestiture competition can be introduced to the domestic market through two channels. One is international trade and the other is the restructuring of the domestic market. The exposure to imports through trade liberalization and the encouragement to exports through such outward-oriented policies as reasonable exchange rates, duty drawbacks, schemes, and easier export licensing can strongly encourage overall efficiency. A critical element of any reforms in the state enterprise sector is the move to market pricing where competition is possible and where it is not, the development of criteria for monopoly tariffs. Price increases are often needed to end further decapitalization of state-owned firms and to avoid the budget drains, wastage, and distortion associated with artificially lower prices. Government should avoid automatic cost-plus pricing and instead seek to provide incentives for managers to look for cost reductions as diligently as they look for price increase. In Turkey, for example, the government monopoly enterprises improved their financial situation and reduced the burden of budget by raising the prices. Governments could also well put together emphasis on reforming the institutional structure for setting tariffs. Several West African countries have begun to specify pricing formulae and efficiency targets through performance contract system modeled on the French contract plan. The experience has not been an unqualified success, but it seems to be a move in the right direction. Breaking up monopolies is becoming a common practice in almost all the developed and developing countries. Utilities in many countries have been broken up into various components. For example, electricity monopoly has been separated into generation, distribution and transmission and supply components. Where reforms have been undertaken, some useful lessons to the government need to be learned. The major lessons that almost all the governments need to implement where they are going towards the privatization or the reforming programs in their respective enterprises, the following lessons need to be learned by almost all the enterprises globally. Devise first sectoral policies that introduce competition and promote private sector development in the public enterprises. They should establish and maintain a sound regulatory framework for the remaining monopolies in the public and private enterprises. Maintain transparency in transactions and convince investors and their investments are sure. Negotiate, monitor, and enforce contracts with private suppliers of management and finances. Ensure that resources from privatization sale are put to productive uses. They should manage the inevitable political and social tensions that arise and ensure that enterprise reforms are implemented with special attention to the issues of foreign ownership and labor layoff. Indeed, failure to manage these issues can see the failure of reform program. Therefore, it is very much essential that for the performance efficiency of any enterprise, that is, the state-owned enterprise in various countries like France, Turkey, South Africa, Australia and Singapore, when coming to Indian concept also, competition plays a very important role in improving the performance of private and public enterprises both. So, in the developing work countries, in the upcoming market structures, in order to compete with the private sector, the state-owned enterprises need to learn these lessons and compete in the market in order to be more profitable and competitive. Thank you.